She had been searching for months, scrolling through listings online and driving around neighborhoods in the hopes of finding something that spoke to her. The dream of owning her own home had been a long one. Living in cramped apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors made her yearn for a place she could call her own, a space where she could breathe, relax, and feel at peace. But the real estate market was tough and the prices were high. It seemed impossible to find anything that wouldn't drain her savings. Then one day, during her usual online search, she saw it. A listing for a small house out in the countryside. The price? Well below anything she had seen. Too good to be true, she thought. The house was old, very old. The photos showed a house with peeling paint, overgrown ivy creeping along the walls, and windows that looked as if they hadn't been cleaned in years. The lawn, if you could even call it a lawn, was more like a wild patch of grass and weeds. There were cracks in the front steps, and the roof looked like it had seen better days. But there was something about it, something that called to her. She had always been one to look past the surface. She could imagine the potential, the charm the house could have once it was cleaned up, once the overgrown garden was tamed, once it was given the love and attention it deserved. She dreamed of a quiet retreat, a place she could make her own. It wasn't just the house she was buying. It was the opportunity to build a life, to start fresh. She drove out the very next day to see it for herself, knowing full well that if she liked it, she'd have to make a decision quickly. Houses like this didn't stay on the market for long, especially at such a low price. The moment she pulled up to the house, her heart raced. The place was even more worn down than the pictures had shown. The porch sagged to one side, and a couple of the windows had cracks in them. The front door hung crooked, as if it had been jarred open by years of neglect. But still she could see it. There was potential here. She walked around the house, taking in every detail. The sound of birds chirping nearby and the soft rustling of the trees made her feel at ease. The house had been abandoned for quite some time, but nature had begun to reclaim it. Wildflowers had pushed their way through the cracks in the driveway, and vines wrapped themselves around the columns of the porch. As she stood there, she could almost imagine how beautiful it could be, how the house could look if someone cared for it. The inside of the house was no better. The floors were covered in dust, the walls marked with stains and cracks. It smelled faintly of mildew. The kitchen was outdated with yellowed cabinets and an old sink that looked like it belonged in a museum. But even then she could picture it. Fresh paint, new fixtures, clean countertops. The layout was cozy, just the right amount of space for one person to feel comfortable. She could see herself cooking in that kitchen, reading books in the living room, and having friends over for quiet dinners. But there was a problem. The house wasn't just old. It was also in need of major repairs. The roof was leaking in a few spots, and some of the wood beams in the attic had rotted away. The plumbing was questionable, and the electrical system looked ancient. It would take a lot of work to make it livable, and it would cost money, more money than she had saved up. She stood in the middle of the living room, hands on her hips, staring at the house and wondering if it was all worth it. The numbers started swirling in her mind. How much she'd have to spend to fix everything, how long it might take to get it into shape, and how she would afford it all. She had enough savings to buy the house itself, but the repairs would be expensive, and she didn't want to take on more debt than she could handle. As she stood there, considering the risk, something strange happened. A sense of calm washed over her. She thought about all the other places she had looked at, how they were too expensive, too perfect, too far from the life she had imagined for herself. This house wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but maybe that was what made it special. It was raw, unpolished, and full of potential. Maybe it was the challenge she had been looking for. She imagined waking up every morning to the sound of birds singing, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and watching the seasons change. She thought about planting a garden and maybe even fixing up the house little by little, turning it into something beautiful. A place that was all hers. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She had always believed that things that were worth having were things that took time and effort to build, and this house, this broken-down place, felt like it was waiting for her to do just that. She called the realtor the next day and made an offer. It was a little lower than the asking price given the state of the house, but she figured it couldn't hurt. A few days later, she got the call. The offer had been accepted. She was officially a homeowner. The feeling was surreal. She had imagined this moment for so long, But now that it was real, she didn't quite know what to do next. She drove back to the house a few days later, excited to begin the journey of fixing it up, but also feeling a little overwhelmed. The task ahead of her was huge, and she had no idea where to start. But she wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She knew she had a lot of work ahead of her, but she also knew that it was going to be worth it. The first thing she did was take a deep breath and step inside again, this time with a sense of ownership. The house was hers now. Every creak of the floorboards, every cracked window, every piece of peeling paint. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of possibility. The journey ahead would be difficult, no doubt. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and probably a few tears along the way. But she also knew that with each step forward, she was creating something new. A home, a life, a dream. And that, she thought, was worth any price. The first few weeks in the house were a blur of dust, paint cans, and tools scattered across every room. It was a bit overwhelming at first. The house had so many problems that it almost felt like a full-time job just figuring out where to begin. But little by little, she started to make progress. She painted the walls, replaced broken windows, and even began working on the garden. It felt good to see things slowly taking shape. One afternoon, after hours of work in the garden, she decided to take a break and explore the house a bit more. She hadn't really gone through the attic yet. It was one of those spaces she'd put off, mostly because it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The stairs leading up to it were steep, and the door to the attic was old and heavy, as if it hadn't been opened in years. But curiosity got the better of her, and she grabbed a flashlight and made her way up. The attic smelled musty, the kind of scent that spoke of long-forgotten memories. Dust covered the floors and cobwebs clung to the corners. There were old trunks stacked in a corner, each one sealed tight. She wiped away some of the dust from a small wooden chest tucked behind a pile of boxes. It was locked, but the lock wasn't strong. A small tug with a rusty tool, and it came undone. Inside the chest, there were a few old pieces of clothing, yellowed dresses, a faded scarf, and some shoes that had long since lost their shape. But it wasn't the clothes that caught her attention. Beneath the clothing, there was a bundle of letters tied together with a thin ribbon. She picked them up carefully, almost afraid to disturb them. The paper was brittle and yellow with age. There were so many of them, too many to count. She sat on the dusty floor of the attic, feeling like she had stumbled upon something important. The letters seemed personal, the kind of things people would write to loved ones, full of hopes and dreams. She carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was written in elegant handwriting, a bit smudged from years of being tucked away. It was addressed to someone named Margaret, and the letters were dated from the 1940s. The letters told the story of a woman named Margaret Thompson, who had lived in the house decades ago. She had written them to a close friend, a woman named Helen, about her life and her dreams. Margaret had always dreamed of turning the house into something special. She wanted to transform it into a place for children who had nowhere to go, orphans who had lost their families during the war. She spoke of creating a home, a sanctuary where children could be safe and loved. As she read the letters, she felt a connection to this woman she had never met. Margaret's words were full of hope, of determination, and of love for the children she wanted to help. There was a kind of magic in her words, a sense of purpose that resonated deeply. Margaret had poured her heart into the house, wanting to create something meaningful. But the dream was never realized. Illness had taken Margaret away far too soon, and the house had fallen into disrepair. The dream of a children's refuge was left unfulfilled. She sat there, surrounded by the silence of the attic, holding the letters in her hands. She felt a lump form in her throat, a mix of sadness and admiration. Margaret's dream, the vision she had held for so many years, had never come to be. The house had been abandoned, left to rot. But here she was now, standing in the same place where Margaret had once dreamed so big. It was almost like the house had been waiting for someone to come along and finish what Margaret had started. She could feel it, this quiet, powerful sense of purpose filling the space around her. She didn't know how, but she knew that this house was meant to be something more than just a home for her. She had always wanted to make a difference in the world, and maybe, just maybe, this was how she was going to do it. She wasn't sure how it would work, or even what it would look like. But something inside her told her that Margaret's dream had to live on. She spent the next few days reading through the letters, one by one, trying to absorb every word. She learned about Margaret's struggles, her hopes, and the vision she had for the house. It was clear that Margaret had put everything she had into this dream, but fate had other plans. Yet the dream was still alive in those letters, waiting for someone to pick it up and carry it forward. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The more she thought about Margaret's dream, the more it felt like the right thing to do. She didn't know if she could ever turn the house into a children's refuge, but maybe she could find another way to help. The thought of the house being a place of learning, of hope, of refuge seemed right. Maybe she could open it to the community in some way, create a space where children could come and learn, or where people could come together and build something meaningful. The more she imagined it, the more it felt like a calling, like a chance to do something good, something that would honor Margaret's memory. She couldn't just leave the house as it was, full of memories, full of dreams that had never been realized. She had to try. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But she knew she had to start somewhere. The first step was to fix the house, make it livable again. But it wasn't just about the repairs anymore. The house had become a symbol of something greater. It wasn't just about restoring the walls and fixing the leaks. It was about restoring a dream, about giving new life to something that had been forgotten. She spent the next few weeks cleaning and repairing the house, but now, with a new sense of purpose. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. The house needed a lot of work, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was crazy for trying to take on so much. But every time she felt uncertain, she thought back to those letters and Margaret's dream. She thought about the children Margaret had wanted to help, and she knew that this was something worth fighting for. As she worked, she began to feel more connected to the house. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a place with a history, with a story. It had been a home to someone else once, and it had the potential to be a home to so many more. The more she worked on the house, the more she felt that she was part of something bigger, part of a legacy that had been passed down through time. The house was beginning to change. The peeling paint was replaced with fresh coats of bright, welcoming colors. The broken windows were fixed. The overgrown garden slowly began to take shape, with flowers blooming and trees starting to grow in neat rows. It wasn't perfect, but it was becoming something beautiful. And with every step she took, she felt Margaret's presence. She could almost imagine her walking through the house, dreaming of the future, dreaming of a place where children could find safety and love. The house, once neglected and forgotten, was coming back to life. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally becoming the place Margaret had always dreamed of. It wasn't long before the small house started to feel like more than just a place to sleep. It began to feel like a home. The walls, once bare and cracked, were now dressed in fresh coats of paint, each stroke of the brush adding a little more life to the rooms. The garden, which had been overtaken by wild weeds, was slowly transforming into a peaceful, organized space, where flowers blossomed in vibrant colors and the scent of fresh soil filled the air. What had once been a rundown cottage was starting to show glimpses of its potential, but even with the visible changes, the work wasn't easy. Every corner seemed to reveal something new that needed attention. There were still leaks in the roof, creaky floorboards, and an endless list of small repairs that never seemed to end. The task was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Some days the progress felt slow, and she'd sit on the front porch staring out at the garden, wondering if she was really doing the right thing. But then, there were days when the house seemed to speak to her. The way the sunlight came through the kitchen window at just the right angle, casting a golden glow across the countertops, made her feel like she was exactly where she needed to be. Or the evening she spent sitting on the back porch, sipping tea while the sky turned shades of pink and orange, listening to the sound of crickets and birds settling for the night. Those moments reminded her why she had chosen this place, this challenge. It wasn't just about fixing up an old house. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could last. As the house slowly took shape, the thought of Margaret's dream never left her mind. She knew she couldn't bring Margaret's vision to life exactly as she had imagined it. It wasn't possible, not with the resources she had. But there was something about the idea of giving back to the community that resonated with her. She thought about the children Margaret had wanted to help, orphans who had lost everything in the chaos of the war. And she realized that maybe, in her own way, she could do something similar. One evening, after a long day of work, she sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the letters Margaret had written. The words were still so clear in her mind, and she could hear Margaret's voice in her head as she read. The dream of creating a safe space for children was still alive in those pages, still calling out to her. It was then that the idea began to form. Maybe the house didn't have to be a refuge for orphans, not in the way Margaret had imagined. But what if it could be a place for children in the community? A place where they could come to learn, to grow, to feel safe? A community center, perhaps. A space for kids to come together after school, to read, to play, to make memories that could last a lifetime. She wasn't sure exactly how it would work, but it felt right. It felt like a way to honor Margaret's dream without having to recreate it perfectly. She began to brainstorm, sketching out ideas on scrap pieces of paper. The living room could be turned into a reading nook with cozy chairs and bookshelves filled with stories. The large kitchen could become a space for cooking classes or group meals. The backyard could be a small garden where kids could learn about planting and growing their own food. There were so many possibilities, and the more she thought about it, the more excited she became. But it was one thing to have an idea, and another to make it happen. The house was far from finished, and she didn't have much money to spare. She'd used most of her savings just to get the house in livable condition. How could she afford to turn it into something that could serve the community? The thought of asking for help, of reaching out to others, made her nervous. She wasn't used to asking for anything. She'd always been independent, doing things on her own. But this was different. This was bigger than her, bigger than the house. So she decided to take a leap of faith. The first step was to talk to her neighbors. Many of them had been skeptical when she first moved in, unsure of what to make of the old house and its new owner. But as she worked on the house, they had begun to notice the changes. The neighborhood had started to look a little brighter, a little more welcoming. The house wasn't just a forgotten relic anymore. It was becoming part of the community again. One by one, she went to visit her neighbors, explaining her idea. At first, some of them weren't sure. It seemed like a big dream for such a small, run-down house. But as she spoke, her passion began to show, and they could see how much this meant to her. Some of them offered to help. An elderly woman down the street offered to donate books for the reading nook. A local teacher volunteered to help organize after-school activities. Others promised to pitch in with small repairs or donate materials they no longer needed. Soon the word spread. What had started as one woman's dream began to take shape as a community effort. People started coming by with donations, old toys, furniture, books, even clothes. Some brought plants for the garden. Others brought tools to help with the repairs. The more people got involved, the more the house began to feel like a shared project, something that belonged to everyone. The house wasn't just being rebuilt. It was being reborn, and it was clear that the community was behind it. The idea of turning it into a space for kids, somewhere they could escape to after school where they could feel safe and have fun, was taking on a life of its own. People were excited. There was a sense of possibility in the air, and it was contagious. One Saturday afternoon, she stood in the middle of the living room, now transformed into a cozy space with bookshelves lining the walls and soft cushions on the floor. The sun was shining through the windows, casting warm light across the room. It was finally starting to feel like the place she had imagined. People were outside, working on the garden, setting up the backyard for outdoor activities. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. It felt good, really good, to see the house come to life like this, not just for her, but for everyone. That evening, she sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with hues of purple and orange, and the cool breeze made the leaves rustle gently. The house felt peaceful, finally at home in its own skin. She knew there was still a lot of work to be done, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. The dream Margaret had started was becoming real little by little. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't exactly as Margaret had imagined, but it didn't need to be. It was something new, something shaped by the hands of many people who believed in it. And for the first time since she had moved into the house, she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. The community had become a part of her journey, and together they were building something that mattered. The house, with all its cracks and flaws, had become a place of hope, of purpose, and of connection. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home for a new dream, one that had been waiting to be realized for a long time. She stood up, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. There was still so much to do, So many steps to take, but she knew she was on the right path. Margaret's dream had found a way to live on, not just in the house but in the people who believed in it, in the children who would someday walk through its doors, and in the community that had come together to make it happen. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had truly found her place. The first few months in the new space felt like a blur of excitement and hard work. The community center was slowly becoming a reality, and it felt like the house was growing along with it. The walls, once faded and cracked, were now vibrant with colors, filled with books, art, and laughter. The backyard was coming alive with the sound of children's voices as they played games or helped plant vegetables in the garden. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place of life, a place where people came together, and it was beginning to feel like home for so many. But even as the center began to take shape, there were still challenges. The first big one came when a group of local children arrived for the first official after-school program. There had been a buzz of excitement for weeks. Parents talked about it at the grocery store, neighbors chipped in with donations, and the whole community seemed eager to see what it could be. She had spent days preparing, setting up spaces for reading, organizing games, and even planning some activities for the children to enjoy. She wanted this to be a place where they could learn, grow, and escape from whatever challenges they might face at home. The day the kids arrived, she stood by the door, nervous but excited. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The house was ready. The space was ready. But was she? When the first child stepped through the door, her heart raced. He was about 10 years old, his shoes a little worn, his eyes wide with curiosity. Behind him was a small group of kids, each of them looking around the space with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. They were all different, some shy, some excited, some a little nervous, but they all had one thing in common. They had never seen anything like this before. The room, which had once been a cold and empty space, was now a cozy place filled with bookshelves, colorful chairs, and a big rug in the middle of the floor. She had tried to make it welcoming, a place where they would feel comfortable, but she could tell by the way they held back that it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about the house, it was about trust. These kids had grown up in neighborhoods where things weren't always stable. They'd seen their parents struggle, or they had to deal with things that no child should have to face. They weren't used to a space that was safe, that was just for them. She smiled and greeted them, trying to make them feel at ease. Slowly, as they settled in, they began to open up. One child wandered over to the bookshelves, pulling out a book and sitting down on the floor to read. Another sat at the table, drawing quietly. It wasn't much at first, just small moments of connection, but it was enough. As the days went on, things started to fall into place. More kids came. Some came for the reading corner, others for the games, and some just to have a place where they could relax and be themselves. The program she had organized started to take off. They made crafts, learned how to cook simple meals, and took turns in the garden, learning about how to grow their own food. Slowly, the house was becoming the sanctuary it was always meant to be. There were tough moments, too. Some kids were shy, others had trouble sitting still for long periods. Some had behavior issues stemming from things they didn't yet know how to talk about. She didn't have all the answers. There were days when she felt like she was in over her head, unsure of how to handle certain situations. But little by little, the kids began to open up, to trust her and the space. They started to share their stories, even if they were just snippets, little pieces of themselves that they hadn't yet shared with anyone else. One afternoon, a girl who had been quiet for weeks came to her after the group activity. She had her hands clenched tightly in front of her, her shoulders hunched. She looked nervous, unsure of how to approach. "I like the house," the girl said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's different." "What do you mean?" she asked, kneeling down so she was at eye level. The girl hesitated, looking around the room before answering. "It feels safe here, it's quiet. I can be myself." The words hit her like a wave. Safe. The one thing that had been missing from so many of these kids' lives was safety. They weren't just coming for the crafts or the books or the games. They were coming because this place was a refuge, a place where they didn't have to worry about what was happening at home or what was going to happen tomorrow. It was a space where they could just be kids. As she looked around the room that day, she realized something. The house, once a place of decay and neglect, had become something more. It wasn't just a physical space anymore. It had become a space for healing, for growth, for connection, and that was worth more than anything she could have imagined. But not everything was perfect. The program wasn't fully funded, and there were still days when they didn't have enough supplies for everyone. There were always more repairs to be done, more things to organize, more needs to address. She spent hours after the kids went home working on the center, trying to make sure it was ready for the next day. There were moments when she felt exhausted, when she questioned whether it was all worth it. The dream was big, and the reality was hard. One afternoon, as she was scrubbing the kitchen floors, a knock on the door broke her concentration. She opened it to find a group of people from the local community, carrying bags of donated food and books. The word had gotten out, and more people were coming to help. Some offered money, others offered their time. There was a local bakery that promised to donate fresh bread every week. A retired teacher had come by to offer her help with tutoring. People were showing up, not because they had to, but because they believed in what was happening. She felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the donations. It wasn't just about the things they were giving. It was the belief in the cause, the faith that this was something worth supporting. And for the first time since she had started, she didn't feel so alone. The house had been a gift. But now it was more than just a house. It was a place where dreams could be realized, a place where a community could come together, a place where kids could find their voices and their strength, and she wasn't doing it alone anymore. That evening, as she sat on the porch, looking out at the quiet street, she thought back to the day she had first walked into the house. She had been full of doubt, unsure of what to expect. She had no idea that it would turn into this. She had no idea that she would be part of something so much bigger than herself, something that was changing lives one child at a time. The journey was far from over, and she knew there were many more challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt hopeful. The dream Margaret had started all those years ago had found its way into her hands, and she was doing her best to carry it forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. The house, with its cracks and creaky floors, had become more than just walls and rooms. It had become a symbol of hope, of possibility, and of community. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to grow, and she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Years passed, and what had once been a worn-down, forgotten house had become something extraordinary. The walls that had once echoed with silence now carried the sounds of laughter, stories, and music. The garden bloomed beautifully, full of colors that changed with the seasons. What had started as one person's small dream had turned into something that touched the lives of many. The little community center had grown in ways no one could have predicted. Children came and went, each leaving behind memories that seemed to linger in every corner of the house. Some of them who had once been shy and quiet were now confident young adults, coming back to visit, helping the new kids who walked through those same doors. The walls were covered with photos, drawings, and thank you notes, reminders of how far they had all come. Every corner of the house told a story. The old reading room was now filled with shelves of donated books, the smell of paper and wood mixing with the scent of fresh flowers from the garden. The kitchen had become a place of laughter and learning, where cooking classes turned into moments of connection, where children learned to bake bread and ended up sharing their stories. The backyard, once overgrown and forgotten, was now a space where the community gathered, sometimes for small celebrations, sometimes just to sit together and talk as the sun went down. She often thought back to the day she found the house. It was strange to think how different life had been then, how uncertain and small her world had seemed. She had only wanted a quiet place to call her own. But the house had given her so much more than that. It had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. It had connected her to people, to stories, to something much bigger than herself. The first time she realized just how much the house had meant to others was during one of their small annual gatherings. Every year they held a little event in the garden to celebrate the anniversary of the center. Families from around town would come, bringing food, stories, and smiles. It wasn't fancy, just tables with homemade dishes, children running around, and music playing softly in the background. But it was beautiful in its simplicity. That year, one of the young men who had been among the first children to visit the center came to speak. He stood on the small wooden porch holding a piece of paper in his hand. He was nervous at first, but then he began to tell his story, how he had come to the house as a lonely boy, unsure of himself, and how the kindness he found there had changed everything. "This house," he said, his voice steady, "was the first place I ever felt like I belonged. It wasn't just a building. It was a place where people believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I don't know where I'd be without it." As he spoke, she felt tears fill her eyes. Around her, others were crying too. It was one of those moments that felt bigger than words, when the weight of all the years, all the effort, and all the love poured into that house came together in one heartbeat. The applause that followed wasn't just for him, but for everyone who had been a part of it, for every person who had helped fix a wall, donate a book, or plant a seed. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, she walked through the quiet rooms of the house. The lights were dim, the air still filled with the faint echo of laughter and music. She paused in front of the small wooden box that still sat on a shelf, the same box she had found years ago in the attic. Inside it were Margaret's letters, carefully preserved. Every now and then she would take them out, read them, and feel the same sense of wonder she had felt that first day. She opened the box now, her fingers brushing over the faded paper. The words, though written decades ago, still carried the same warmth and hope. Margaret had dreamed of creating a place of safety and love for children, and even though she hadn't lived to see it, her dream had found a way to live on. The house had become exactly what she had imagined, maybe even more. She sat down in the old armchair by the window, the one she had restored herself, and let her mind wander. She thought about all the people who had come and gone through those doors, the volunteers, the families, the children who had grown up and returned with their own kids. It amazed her how one old, forgotten house had managed to bring so many lives together. It had healed people, built friendships, and created a space where kindness could grow. As the night grew quieter, she looked around and smiled. The walls were full of memories now, paintings made by children, handprints on the garden fence, laughter caught in the air. This was more than just a home or a community center. It was proof that something broken could become whole again, that something old could find new life if someone was willing to care. Not long after, a local journalist came by to do a story about the center. They had heard about the transformation of the house and wanted to share it with a wider audience. The day of the interview, she felt a little nervous. She wasn't used to talking about herself. When the journalist arrived, they sat in the garden, surrounded by the flowers and the sounds of children playing in the distance. "You must be very proud," the journalist said, smiling as they looked around. "It's incredible what you've done with this place. When you bought the house, did you ever imagine it would become this?" She paused for a moment, looking down at her hands, then back at the house. "No," she said softly. "When I bought it, I thought I was just buying a cheap house. I thought I was just fixing something broken. I didn't know that it would end up fixing me too." The journalist smiled, scribbling notes, then asked, "If you could sum up what this house has given you, what would you say?" She looked at the garden, the bright flowers, the laughter, the light pouring through the trees. "It gave me purpose," she said simply. "It gave me a chance to do something that matters. I came here looking for a home, but what I found was a community, a family, and a story that will outlive me. I guess you could say, what I got was priceless." The article was published a few weeks later, and soon after more people came to visit. Some wanted to volunteer, others just wanted to see the house that had touched so many hearts. It became a symbol in the town, a reminder that hope could grow in the most unexpected places. Years later, the house continued to thrive. Children still played in the garden, laughter still filled the air, and the walls still carried the warmth of countless memories. It had become a place where everyone was welcome, no matter who they were or where they came from. Sometimes she would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, and think about how far everything had come. She would think of Margaret and wonder what she would say if she could see it now. Maybe she would smile. Maybe she would whisper a quiet, "Thank you." The world outside the little house kept changing. People came and went. New buildings were built. New faces appeared. But the house remained the same. A safe, loving place, filled with laughter, kindness, and the spirit of something beautiful that had started long ago. And every time someone new stepped through those doors, they felt it too. The sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger. That was the true magic of the house. It wasn't in the walls or the paint or the furniture. It was in the people. It was in the love that had built it, and the dreams that continued to live within it. The house had started as something cheap, something forgotten. But in the end, what it gave back to the world couldn't be measured in money or possessions. It gave warmth, it gave meaning, it gave life, and that truly was priceless.